And I think that's what's happening throughout the region.
So you're saying basically that the United States government, in its oppression of the Arab countries, promotes the Islamic fundamentalist movements?
Well, the United States government would prefer that the oppression work, and it would prefer that things be quiet, manageable conflict. But the result of American policies, what you push here, and what happens? Something else comes up somewhere else. So the result of this kind of oppression, the result of taking away people's dignity and people's pride, is that something else happens and it comes back in another form. Well, the Islamic governments can easily arrest intellectuals. They can always find a reason to arrest a journalist or a poet, or, God, if I read some of the poems by Ghassan Kanafani, or, you know, they're very tearful. But it's very hard if you're a government in the Arab world to arrest people because they go to mosques. It's very hard to arrest them because they dress up in religious outfits. So what the new governments are trying to do is they're now trying to license the imams and the preachers, and I don't know all the religious terms. I'm an atheist, my Jewish atheist myself. But they're trying to control the mosques by government restrictions. And it works to a certain extent, but what it does is it pushes the discussions underground. Instead of going to the mosque to hold the political discussion, you now go to somebody's house. Instead of going to a hotel to hold an open conference, you now go to a secret room to hold a very private conference. Instead of being willing to meet with Mark Bruzonsky, who comes visiting from America, even though you've heard he might be a nice guy, you decide not to meet with him because maybe he's not a nice guy. Maybe he's really working for the Mossad or the CIA. So what we're doing is we're creating a whole generation that is going deeper and deeper into the underground, is deeper and deeper becoming more radicalized, is having less and less contact with more moderate people and more intellectual people. And when they rise up, what happened in Iran? I mean, the same thing happened in Iran, a 20-year process after the CIA put the Shah back on the throne. It was a fairly moderate businessman's liberal revolution in 1953, but the revolution that came 25 years later was a horrendous revolution because it was conducted by people who had been tortured and pushed underground for a whole generation. My suspicion is the same thing is going to happen in Egypt, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen maybe 20, 30 years from now. And maybe the Americans won't care then, because maybe by that time we'll have pumped enough oil. Maybe we'll have another energy source. And our main reason for being in the region, which is economic and, well, this is a strong term, but we have only a few minutes. I leave here in a few minutes. You'll probably never see me again. We steal the resources of the Middle East in the name of American security interests and American strategic interests, and we float our fleets in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and we tell anybody who doesn't like what we do, screw you.
Do you know, I don't think the Middle East, the Arab people, would mind that so much if the government did not interfere in putting, installing their own governments there.
But it has to, because if we didn't interfere in that, we couldn't keep the scam going.
Who should America replace these repressive thugs and dictators?
I don't think America should replace anybody. I think America get out of the way.
I mean, why should America has to run these people?
Well, we have national interest there, but no, I was just curious. I'm not disagreeing with you necessarily. I'm saying perhaps our policy in the long term is self-defeating because we're not promoting democracy and self-determination for these peoples in these various nations. America does have a foreign policy. We do practice foreign policy, and I'm asking her a practical question. Who should we make contact with? Who should we support? Should we push reforms upon these governments? What in the real world should we do?
The United States
promote self-determination.
Laughs at us. Nobody in the world has energy at this in these price ranges.
It's traded in dollars.
That's
don't know that.
But it's not, for a country that prides itself in freedom of speech, in democracy, in self-determination, in private institutions, it's not for us to tell the Saudis who should rule in Saudi Arabia. It's for us to get out of the way and stop propping up. And I mean, talk about what happened in Saudi Arabia a few months ago when the National Guard was blown up. What is the Saudi National Guard? The Saudi National Guard is the Praetorian Guard of the Saudi royal family, paid for, trained by the United States of America. Its job is to make sure that this corrupt, despicable group of sheikhs and princes that goes around the world pretending to be some royal elite, but on the whole are a bunch of snobs and jerks, the king of Saudi Arabia. He's a playboy. He spent most of his life in Beirut. He was there when you were there, buying women for $100,000 a night, gambling in casinos, drinking himself into dead stupors. And this is the Saudi royal family. Now, you're not allowed to say these things in the Arab world. You give a speech like this in the Arab world, and I've been to Saudi Arabia, and if you're American, you will never again return to Saudi Arabia. I suspect I am now blacklisted in Saudi Arabia. I've been there 3 times. If you're a Saudi, before I leave the country, you're visited and taken away, and no one's ever going to hear from you again. This discussion cannot take place in the Arab world unless you go behind closed doors, lock the door, and are sure that the only people there are friends of yours, in which case that's how undergrounds get created. But I didn't mean to neglect you. No.
You think that the solution would the United States is contributing to the problem. So you think the United States should back out. Do you think that the conflict won't still exist if the United States backs out? So 20 years, do you think that the problem is going to be non-existent? Do you think that
Which
people are still going to die? The conflict between Israel and Palestine. Do you think that the United States, you're saying the United States should just back out? Should we just turn our backs and say, this is going on?
The United States should say to Israel, number one, we're not going to any longer give you $4 billion a year. Jewish lobby or no Jewish lobby. Number two, you better solve this problem in a just and reasonable way with the Palestinians, because it's a cancer on the region, and it's a cancer which is harming everyone involved, and it's up to you to solve it. You created the mess. Gaza wasn't created by America. Gaza was created by Israel, by pushing all the refugees that used to live in other places into this little ghetto. Now, I'm not saying that this should happen tomorrow morning. I'm not saying we should all wake up and our foreign policy should totally be reversed and everything will be fine and dandy. If you create a terrible mess, and we have helped, and the British before us helped, and the Ottomans before us weren't all that wonderful either, but the mess in the Middle East is not going to clear up overnight. But the one thing we should do is stop propping up the repressive forces, stop training the torturers, stop rewarding those governments and families and dictators who are doing these awful things to their own people. And we should say to the people of the region, we are not any longer hypocrites. We actually believe in democracy. We actually believe in human rights. We actually believe in self-determination. And we are going to work for those things instead of against those things.
So with our aid, they're not listening to us. Do you think that if we stop giving them aid, it's going to become clearer to them?
The Israelis, you mean?
Yes. That it's going to become clearer to them that they need to resolve the conflict?
Yes, these are...
Do you think, so if we stop giving them aid, you know, over time, they're going to say, well, we're not receiving aid, so the problem is going to get better?
The Israelis are able to do what they do for a couple of reasons. One, economically, we give them $1,000 a person per year. Nobody in the world gets that kind of subsidy. Our own people don't get anywhere near that kind of subsidy. Number two, we provide them military protection. They know that if someone decides to revenge against them for what they've done, that the American military is going to come and protect them. They should be told, you are not the 50, whatever it is, state of the United States, that we will not treat you as an appendage of the United States any longer. You live in the Arab world, and you better make an accommodation with this Arab world, because sooner or later, if you do not, the day will come that they will have weapons of mass destruction, that they will get weapons that you have, that they will remember what you did in Lebanon and what you did to Palestinian villages and what we did to Iraq. The only reason the Israelis didn't help us is because they were totally unneeded. We had the American military to destroy Iraq. There was no reason to ask the Israelis to get involved. The Israelis now believe that they can get away literally with murder, and they are right. They can. So,
They have been doing it for the last 50 years.
but it comes at a price of hatred, of the desire for revenge, and of an Arab world that is arming. In one of the programs, one of the TV programs that I made recently, I was in Cairo, and I spoke to a man whose name you won't know, but maybe you will know, Mohammed Sid Ahmed from Al-Ahram. You're shaking your head. He's a coat and tie aristocrat. I mean, he wouldn't know how to go out somewhere without a three-piece suit. And he's telling me, we know it's not a real peace. We know we've been screwed. We know we've been had. Even our government in Egypt will have to develop nuclear weapons unless the Israelis stop developing theirs. That the whole Arab world is being forced in this direction, regardless of the fact that the Americans try to control the situation. So the time to stop a future war of mass destruction in the Middle East is now, before it's too late.
Because Israel will be the one that will get destroyed eventually.
Yeah, but Israel will take everyone down with it.
Oh, fine.
Well, this book's been written. The book's been written. We have a journalist in this country. He's a friend of mine, Seymour Hersh. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. How many of you have heard of the book, The Samson Option?
Yeah,
Okay. Here's a guy. He happens to be Jewish. He's not particularly against Israel. He was the man who discovered the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, worked for the New York Times. He wrote a book called The Samson Option. And what's the discussion? The book is how the United States helped Israel develop nuclear weapons and how the Israelis will threaten the entire Arab world. That if anyone ever does try to revenge against what's been done, they, the Israelis, will take out Cairo and Damascus and Amman and Riyadh. And the theme of his book is that the Israelis are meshugana enough because of the Holocaust, which of course the Arab world had nothing to do with. The Holocaust was Christian Europe that killed the Jews. That the Israelis are meshugana enough because of the Holocaust that they would actually do such a thing. And I think Sy wrote the book as a warning that this is the future of the Middle East on the course that we're on. Now, why did this peace process begin? This peace process, I think, began because the Americans and the Israelis realized, that's right, the course we're on is not a good one. So we have to adjust the course. Now, we can't really change our policies. We don't really want the Palestinians to have independence. But we have to get the world to believe that we're handling things more thoughtfully, that there's autonomy, that there's a peace process, that things are getting better. The only problem with that is that the realities of the situation, as I tried to explain to you earlier, are not in conformity with the rhetoric of the situation. So you hear about peace process, Palestinians hear about more oppression. You hear your president say, Yasser Arafat, Rabin, Arafat shake hands. What the Palestinians see is that now not only do they have the Israeli army occupying them, they've also got the Palestinian police occupying them. You're shaking your head, and you're from Palestine.
Well, it's the understanding in the Palestinian world is that Arafat came as a policeman, basically, for the Israelis. He's there as their policeman. He's got his little state, quote unquote, but in return for that, he's just keeping an eye.
He doesn't have a state. He has some money. What Arafat was given was money and guns. And the deal was, he is, in the 20s and 30s, the British created royal families. They created the Al Sauds, they created the Al Sabahs, they created the Hashemites, they divided up the Arab world, they gave each of them their throne. It was very cheap at the time. The British pound was worth a lot. You could 10,000 pounds to the early Hashemite king probably kept him in power for a year. Now we're creating another client regime. This one's called, you don't have a royal family in Palestine. So we had to find someone else, and we found this guy who was penniless, who was broke, who was a total failure, who had led his people from one catastrophe and one misery to another. I read you Chomsky's quote. He's hated and despised by the intellectuals. His people are largely gangsters and thugs. The PLO, the Israelis had assassinated most of the better Palestinian leaders, so there wasn't... all right. And then I'll tell you when I think this really got serious. Poor Yasser had a little plane crash in the Libyan desert, I think. And the Israelis and the Americans panicked because they'd been setting this guy up as an eventual quisling, as an eventual collaborator, and they kind of realized, holy mackerels, we almost lost him. And there wasn't anybody to replace him. I mean, there is no second Arafat. There is no Arafat Jr. Now, unlike most people, I believe the Israelis are using him and then would prefer he be removed. But they can't remove him. They prefer Hamas remove him. Then they will say to the world, what can we do? We did everything we could. We even signed a peace treaty. We were on the road to independence and statehood and autonomy and justice. Of course, none of that is true. But it will go over big in a public relations context. And then the final straw will be in, because the Palestinians will be totally divided from each other. They'll have a civil war, which they're very close to. And I believe that's actually the Israeli policy. The Israeli policy is, first option, Arafat control his own people, and we divide them up, like on this map, and our settlements stay. And by the way, we forgot to tell you that these bypass roads that we're building with American money, these are Jewish-only roads. Palestinians can't go on these roads. We're now separated. Well, the South Africans made the dastardly mistake of announcing what their policy was. They gave it a word, apartheid, and they called the things Bantustans, and all this developed a very skeptical world reaction, and the world said, we're not going to get involved with you guys with Bantustans and apartheid. The Israelis are smarter than that. They call it autonomy and progress, and then they draw maps like this.
Take the water, control the water, so
and then if Palestinian young kids are hopeless and have no sense of possibilities and see no good ahead for them, and they turn into terrorists and gangsters, when you oppress a people long enough, we all turn into terrorists and gangsters. But we can come and have this meeting and get it, get it a little out of our system.
Can I ask you a couple of questions? Now, the first one is, given that I should tell you other people from the pro-Israel group, and the prequel failed to align with U.S. foreign policy was the State Department. Aren't you presenting U.S. policy as a bit more monolithic than it actually is?
Yes, because we have one afternoon, and I'm giving. The State Department doesn't really matter. The State Department is an appendage of the government. They are hired hands. I've lectured at the War College, which is connected with the State Department. I've stayed at ambassador residences in Khartoum and other capitals. These are nice people. They're hired to do a job. They come in for 20, 30 years. They retire with a pension. They do what April Glaspie does. They're told to go see Saddam Hussein. They're told to deliver a message. They deliver the message. So of course I'm condensing and summarizing. I'm giving you what I think is the guts of the reality of American foreign policy. Does that mean that there aren't people who oppose it? Who's George Ball? George Ball was the Assistant Secretary of State. He's written book after book that sounds more like me than sounds like anybody in the American government, but he's also dead. And he can't come to visit you. And if he were here, obviously he held very prestigious positions. He might disagree with some of the formulations. He's a more diplomatic personality than I. I don't have to be diplomatic because I don't have to answer to anybody in the State Department. But I just mentioned to you people like Ramsey Clark, people like George Ball.
Well, his son is still going on.
Yeah, but his son wasn't Assistant Secretary of State and doesn't have his prestige. So the answer to your question is absolutely. I have to condense a lot of stuff, including 25 years of experiences, into little parables and little stories in the hour that we have. And I hope I'm doing at least an informative job. I make mistakes, and I overdo it sometimes, just like, others.
As a follow-up to that, when you mentioned this Jewish lobby, let me ask you, who's exactly involved in this? And the second thing is, how do they do what they do that you feel makes them so successful in terms of influencing U.S. policy?
And that's sort of a final question, huh? You should have started all over. The whole session should be Washington and the Jewish lobby. Well, politics and money. Politics in Washington, I'm sorry, I'll use gross terms and fall right into the trap you've suggested I'm already falling into. To be a politician under the current game of politics in Washington is to be a prostitute. You can be a nicer prostitute or a less nice prostitute, but in the end, you must beg for money, you must beg for support, and if you don't kowtow to the powerful interests, you're not coming back. So who's Bill Clinton? During the campaign, the president of the Jewish lobby, and you ask, what is it? It's 40-some organizations that come together under a larger umbrella called the President's Conference. And then it's one particular organization, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which lobbies the Congress. And what do? Well, for instance, if you're the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, like Senator Fulbright was, or Chuck Percy was, and if you start holding hearings and inviting speakers like Mark Bruzonsky to come and give his views, they let it be known that you really shouldn't do that again, Chuck. And if you do that again, they let it be known that we're going to oppose you, Chuck. And if you do it again, they find millions of dollars, and the next time you're running for election, somehow there's this mystery candidate who nobody heard of 6 months before, but who now has millions of dollars at his disposal, and they help defeat you. Now, if you're in Congress and you see one leader after another being defeated, Chuck Percy, Bill Fulbright, Pete McCloskey, Paul Findley, it doesn't take a great mental capacity to understand that if your goal is to come back in the next term in Congress, it would not be a good idea to be targeted by the National Rifle Association or the American Israel Public Affairs Committee or any of the other couple of powerful interests that can defeat you. And if you're a journalist wanting to be an editor of the Washington Post, you quickly learn that it doesn't do you much good to go off and sympathetically write an article about the struggle of the Palestinian people for their freedom, because somehow that's not going to further your career in Washington. So Washington, I'm sad to say, and I know it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it makes the point. It's not a town of hookers waiting on the street to be picked up. It's a town of well-dressed, well-manicured people available for sale because they want to come and hold these positions, and they know that they have to get powerful and influential interest groups with money to back them. And the biggest change that's needed in Washington is not to change the nature of the Jewish lobby, or the biggest change that's needed in Washington is to take PACs and lobbyists out of the financial, to make it illegal for them to contribute to campaigns in certain ways. For instance, if you're running for office in Ohio, it shouldn't be possible for some Jewish philanthropist in California to give your opposing candidate $2 million to run his campaign. But this isn't going to change, and it's not going to change quickly, because as you'll remember, Bill Clinton promised us he was going to bring us health care and campaign finance reform. Well, what did he bring us?
Nothing. Disasters.
Going back to what you said earlier, I don't think the US was wrong in arming Israel with nuclear weapons, because they're a country of 4 million people surrounded by 200 million Arabs. And this is no offense to anyone here, but when Arabs go at war, they don't fight just war. For them it's like a holy war, it's like some jihad or something. They would just run over these 4 million people.
Okay, and so instead the Israelis run over them.
And you said these people are jerks, or these Arab royal families, they're jerks. Jerks don't have a right to nuclear weapons. It's good they don't have them.
Well, you've got a point, but I wasn't suggesting that we continue to support the jerks. You know something about oppression in India. You know something about occupation. I'm not saying that it's going to be a good world. I said that the intellectuals of the Arab world are telling me that even those corrupt jerks, even those governments that are in the American pocket, are going to be pushed by their own internal political dynamics, and by just because you're the president of Egypt doesn't mean, and just because the military supports you doesn't mean that there aren't pressures on you. It doesn't mean that there aren't social and political pressures. The Egyptian military is divided. The Egyptian military would like to develop weapons because it's not sure the peace is going to hold. What happens if the peace doesn't hold? What happens if there's terrorism, some of it starting from Egypt? What happens if the Israelis decide to attack again? They've done it before. The Israelis have bombed Cairo before. So what I'm suggesting is that if the current situation